So I just want to talk about a few of the key findings of the book, and then I'll illustrate them with ethnographic examples. So the first is the relationship between care and kinship. There are pre-existing networks of care that protected orphans in the time of AIDS, a long history in Lesotho of grandmothers caring for grandchildren for lots of different reasons. So when this newest crisis came along, these networks sort of kicked into high gear, but with different benefits for the grandmothers and the grandchildren, no longer necessarily being a sort of positive reciprocal relationship, but being a crisis fostering situation that, but it's still based on these pre-existing practices. Grandmothers are doing a lot of this work, as you, if you read the book, as you read in there, that if a grandmother is available and the mother is not, the grandmother is always preferred even over the father. And because of this, there's been a shift to matrilocal care. A lot of times what happens is a woman will become sick with HIV, move back to her natal home or her parents' home where she grew up, and then she'll die, and the parents will end up staying with the mother's children. This isn't because they're already there, so it's just more convenient. It's because the mothers have brought their children to the place where they feel most well cared for, where they think their children will be most well cared for, especially in the context of lower marriage rates, lower rates of paying bride wealth, the customary payment from the man's family to the woman's families to sort of compensate the family for the loss of their daughter in the household. And with those payments reduced, marriages were sort of weakened in a way. And so what ended up happening was mothers' families were caring, even though it was in the context of strongly patrilineal societies. So people for a long time have been predicting a collapse of care networks because of HIV that actually hasn't happened. There was very few children that I came into contact with through MCS. Of the thousands of clients they've served, only maybe half a dozen have ended up being adopted by someone unrelated or in an orphanage in the city. So for the most part, people are still able to find someone within their extended family to care for the child. But that doesn't mean it's not under difficult circumstances. What conditions are those children being cared for in? What are elderly people having to do beyond their physical capacity in order to provide that care? Those are important questions to ask. And as grandmothers get older and they are starting to, grandmothers sort of missed HIV because they were beyond their sexual prime when it started to hit about a quarter of a century ago now. But they are getting older and dying of other reasons, chronic disease, old age, and so who's going to care for children now? That's one of the challenges that I talk about in the last chapter of the book. So Hopalong and Memo Reina, you'll recognize Hopalong from the last story that Will wrote in the conclusion of the book. But Memo Reina lived with her own grandmother when she was young, and she liked to help her grandmother and liked to live with her. And she cared for Hopalong, which is the child of her grandson, and Hopalong's sister, and that seemed reasonable to her because of her own experience living with her own grandmother. And when I visited her in 2013 on my fourth visit to Lesotho, she was sick, and I asked her, when you can no longer care for Hopalong, what are you going to do? And she told me, when I die, the family will take care of the children. They will sit down and say, here are the children. So they will ask, is there anyone who will take responsibility when Nkgono has died? And Nkgono means grandmother. And she said there was a grandson that she was hoping would take them. And I asked if he showed any interest in taking them. And she said, no, he doesn't care about them. He doesn't take any responsibility. This boy doesn't ever visit, and his wife never visits either. It hurts my heart, she said. I'm worried, but there's nothing I can do. And then a few months after that visit, actually, she did pass away. And as you read in the story at the end of the book, the sisters got separated. They ended up moving around a little bit, and then finally ended up with a relative who could care for them. But that the sort of threat of grandmaternal death is harming kids or putting them into bad situations. So the second point that I want to talk about is how people make decisions around their health using a biosocial lens. So one of the things that this helps us to do is, because we're not just looking at, people don't make health decisions just based on the sort of pathology of illness or biomedical information. They're making it based on their embedded selves, and those are social selves as well. And so thinking about something as biosocial rather than understanding it as being a purely biomedical decision helps to put seemingly irrational behavior in context. For example, why would someone, not get HIV tested or stop taking their medication? Um, well, if you just think about it as like a biomedical reasoning, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you think about it in terms of the stigma around HIV or, the painful truth that it reveals about infidelity or anything like that, then it makes a certain amount of sense. So people sometimes, because of this kind of decision making, people sometimes prioritize their social well-being over their health. And this impacts the effectiveness of interventions, usually around prevention of HIV, getting people to test, and treatment of HIV. If interventions fail because they're not culturally appropriate or whatever the reason, it's often because people are only thinking about it as a biomedical response, not a socially embedded person who's responding, bringing their whole selves to bear. So an example of that that I don't talk about in the book, these are the Ntonto triplets, clients of MCS that we went to visit shortly after they were born. This represents this couple's 8th, 9th, and 10th children. So they already had 7 children before these triplets were born. The mother's HIV positive. And we went to the family before she had given birth because you can go wait at the hospital to give birth, but if you have 7 other children to care for, that can be challenging. And she didn't want to come to the hospital. And then after the children were born, because breastfeeding through triplets is challenging even if you don't have HIV, but that can also suppress milk. Triplets make it much more likely for you to go into labor early, which she did, and these kids were all about 5 pounds or less after a couple weeks of birth. And so the MCS, the organization, went to the family and said, look, we think the kids will be better off in the safe home, especially one of them who was having a hard time eating enough food and wasn't gaining weight at the rate that they should have been. And the parents, especially the father, said, no, these are our children. They're going to be best cared for in our home the way we've cared for our other 7 children. And, we kind of thought that the kids were vulnerable enough that they should come home, but you can understand why the father thought, why would I give a baby's place is with its mother, with his family, and we've successfully cared for all these other children. And 2 of them did end up being hospitalized and contracting HIV, and one of them passed away. So it'd be easy to tell that story in a way that makes the family seem like they made the wrong decision, and maybe they did, but in order to understand their motivation, it was coming from a place of love and care that they thought this was the best way to care for their child. So the third thing is how people present AIDS as being like any other disease is kind of a really important insight to understanding how people respond to HIV. A lot of the stigma around HIV is kind of resolved by taking this attitude that this is like other diseases that we've seen before. People normalize HIV/AIDS to reduce stigma if you sort of connect it to diseases that existed before HIV came around, or if you kind of say treat it like tuberculosis, or perhaps if you focus on the symptoms rather than the underlying illness, which people often do, then that kind of helps to reduce the stigma around HIV. And in some ways is positive because it normalizes it. In other ways, it makes it hard to talk about it specifically in order to get people the care and treatment they need. People do have a preference for biomedical treatment for what they perceive to be foreign illnesses like HIV, rather than going to the traditional healer, which they may do. Some people do and some people don't, but if you're going to, you would do that for something that you thought originated from within Lesotho, like a local illness like Nonyana is an illness that babies often get. That's a cluster of symptoms that might be familiar to us, but are sort of locally defined as this one particular Sesotho illness. That's a cultural group of Lesotho. And so but if a disease like HIV or TB is perceived to be coming from the outside in or a foreign illness, then most people prefer biomedical treatment for it, which is good because you need to take ARVs in order to live when you have HIV. People also rely on symptoms, as I was just saying. A lot of times the cause of death would be something like diarrhea or tuberculosis because HIV reduces your immune response and then makes you more likely to get secondary infections like tuberculosis, and that would be what you die of, even though the AIDS is why you had those vulnerabilities in the first place. People do use medical pluralism means, seeking treatment in multiple different ways. So if you see a traditional healer and you see a biomedical doctor, is common in low resource settings because people are sort of gaining access to all the courses of treatment that they have available to them. And so that is what we see in Lesotho as well, even though for the most part, people do go to the doctor for HIV. One of the challenges is that people are getting information about HIV and AIDS in a lot of different ways. So they hear gossip from their neighbors. They are getting public health messages. They're hearing things from the pulpit when they go to church. They listen to news call-in radio shows where people have different opinions about things. And then, of course, there's misinformation even coming from the South African government in the early days of the epidemic, or in the 2000s. And so people aren't really sure what to believe sometimes, even though they might be inclined to trust the information coming from the doctor or the health clinic. They might say, but I've heard this other thing so many times, like the story about lots of people think that condoms have little worms in them that cause AIDS. And so people will say, I'm pretty sure that's not true, but I'm not entirely sure, because there's all these different sources of information coming at them, and it's hard for them to sort out what's accurate or what's not. So Ndate Kappa was a really great example of that. He's the grandfather of Kotsi. His daughter, who died, had two sons, Kotsi and Kotsi's brother, who lived with Ndate Kappa. And he went to the adherence sessions, which are 3 mandatory government sessions that tell you about how to care for someone with HIV. And when Kotsi was starting on his medication, on his antiretroviral medication. So he'd been trained in these 3 sessions. He took his grandson to the clinic every day. He did a really good job giving him his medication all the time, but he also wasn't entirely sure how to sort out accurate information. And when I asked him what happens when you get HIV, he said, HIV is when the veins are not working properly and it stops people's blood and the blood is not clean. And then he said, after that, he said, I think it sucks all the blood and that person will end up having no blood at all, which blood is an important substance that people use to understand their connections to their kin. So the stakes of losing all your blood is not just physical, but is social. And this is someone who I would have thought had a good deal of information. So even people who I thought were very knowledgeable sometimes were misinformed. So how can this perspective inform the global response to HIV/AIDS? How does this research help us to respond to this crisis or other similar crisis? Well, first is to understand that AIDS impacts every aspect of social life. So you can't just focus on the person and their caregiver. You have to look at the whole social landscape. The second is to understand the deep ways in which biology and culture are intertwined, and that in order to understand how someone's going to respond to something, you need to have those two kind of ideas integrated. The third is to understand that in this particular case, where the prevalence rate is 23%, AIDS has become a part of people's families, as a part of kinship, as opposed to being, just something that a few families are having to deal with. Also, interventions and programs need to recognize that the intersections of AIDS and kinship and biology and culture in order to be effective. You need to understand the cultural context in a profound way and gain feedback from people who really understand it in order to design interventions that are going to work. Finally, the role of ethnography and culturally competent intervention research really helps you to understand this richness, to get a sense of how people might be thinking about something. That anthropology can help to highlight those things. And then awareness of ongoing changes to understand how things are going to change going forward, in particular demographic shifts as grandmothers die, who's going to start caring for orphans. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this talk.